Police officers have fun touching the skirt of a black woman, shocked to learn she's a CIA agent. In a quiet town where secrets are buried deeper than trust, one late-night operation would reveal corruption hiding in plain sight. A black woman, calm, composed, and underestimated, walks into a storm of power and abuse. What happens next will leave you speechless. Behind her poised exterior lies a shocking truth that will change everything for the men who thought they could get away with anything. The small-town diner buzzed with the quiet hum of conversation, clinking cutlery, and the soft murmur of an old radio in the corner. The warm scent of coffee mingled with the greasy aroma of fried bacon and pancakes, wrapping the room in a comfort that contrasted sharply with the chill of the late autumn morning. Angela Hayes sat in a booth near the window, her back straight, hands folded neatly on the table. Her outfit, a tailored navy dress that fell just below her knees, made her stand out among the flannel shirts and worn jeans that defined the usual clientele. Her natural curls framed her face, and her deep brown eyes scanned the street outside, her expression calm but attentive. She appeared to be just another traveler passing through, stopping for a quiet meal before continuing her journey. That's how she wanted it to look. Angela had been in the town for 3 days, blending in just enough to avoid suspicion. Her mission was clear: gather evidence of systemic corruption within the police department, a task she approached with her usual precision. This town, with its history of racial profiling and whispered accusations of abuse, had drawn the attention of higher authorities. It was her job to confirm what they suspected. A plate of scrambled eggs and toast was placed in front of her. She glanced up, giving the waitress a polite smile. "Thank you." The woman, a middle-aged redhead with tired eyes, hesitated for a moment. "You sure you're okay here, hon?" Her voice was low, almost a whisper, as if she didn't want to be overheard. Angela tilted her head slightly, her curiosity piqued. "Why wouldn't I be?" The waitress glanced over her shoulder at 2 uniformed police officers seated at the counter. One of them, a burly man with a shaved head, was laughing loudly, his voice carrying across the room. The other, lean with a sharp jawline, leaned back on his stool sipping coffee as his eyes flicked toward Angela. There was an unmistakable smugness in his gaze, a predatory look that made the waitress shift uncomfortably. "They like to mess with people," the waitress muttered, "especially folks who stand out." Angela followed the woman's gaze, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied the officers. They were oblivious to her scrutiny, engrossed in their own conversation. One of them slapped the other on the back, their laughter echoing through the diner. She turned back to the waitress, her expression unreadable. "I'll be fine," Angela said softly. Her tone carried a quiet confidence that seemed to reassure the woman, who nodded and walked away. Angela picked up her fork, taking a bite of her eggs as she kept her focus on the reflection in the window. She had been trained to observe without being obvious, to notice the smallest details. The burly officer, his name tag read Bradley, had a habit of adjusting his belt every few minutes, a telltale sign of discomfort. The leaner one, Jenkins, seemed more relaxed, but his eyes darted around the room, scanning for attention like a predator looking for prey. They weren't just ordinary officers, she could tell. The arrogance in their body language spoke volumes about their sense of authority. They were used to being in control, used to being feared. Angela had seen men like them before, men who believed their badge made them untouchable. She set her fork down and sipped her coffee, the warmth spreading through her fingers as she held the mug. Her calm demeanor belied the tension simmering beneath the surface. She knew it was only a matter of time before they made their move. Men like Bradley and Jenkins couldn't resist the temptation of an easy target, especially one they perceived as vulnerable. Sure enough, the scrape of chairs against the linoleum floor drew her attention. Bradley and Jenkins had finished their meal and were heading her way. She didn't turn to look at them, instead focusing on her coffee as if they weren't worth her time. Well, Bradley drawled, his voice dripping with mock friendliness. "What brings a pretty thing like you to our fine little town?" Angela set her mug down and looked up, her gaze meeting his without a hint of fear. "Just passing through," she replied evenly. Jenkins chuckled, crossing his arms as he leaned against the edge of her table. "Passing through, huh? You got ID to prove that?" Angela raised an eyebrow, her calm expression never wavering. "Do I need to prove anything?" Bradley's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Well, let's just say we like to know who's visiting our town. Keeps things safe, you know." Angela reached into her purse, pulling out ID with deliberate slowness. She handed it to Bradley, who snatched it up with a smirk. As he looked it over, she noticed Jenkins's gaze lingering on her dress, his lips curling into a lecherous grin. "Nice dress," Jenkins remarked. "Where'd you get it?" "Big city fashion." Angela ignored the comment, her focus on Bradley as he frowned at her ID. "You're a long way from D.C., he said. "What's a federal employee doing out here?" "Vacation," she lied smoothly. "I needed a break from the city." Bradley handed back her ID, but not before Jenkins leaned down, brushing his fingers against the hem of her skirt. "Fancy fabric," he said, his voice low. "But it costs more than my whole wardrobe." Angela's hand tightened around her coffee mug, but her face remained calm. "You should keep your hands to yourself," she said, her tone sharp enough to cut through the air. Bradley laughed, the sound grating. "Relax, sweetheart. We're just being friendly." Angela leaned back in her seat, her eyes locking onto Bradley's. "I don't think you understand what friendly means," she said, her voice cold. "But you're about to learn." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Bradley's face. Jenkins, however, remained oblivious, still grinning like a fool. Angela didn't need to escalate the situation. She knew it would escalate itself. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was only a matter of time. The tension in the diner was palpable. The soft hum of conversation had faded to a murmur, and even the clink of utensils against plates seemed to stop. Angela Hayes sat motionless in her booth, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. Her calm exterior masked the storm brewing within her. She knew exactly what kind of men Bradley and Jenkins were, and she had no intention of letting them walk away from this unscathed. Bradley leaned in closer, his large frame towering over the table. The faint scent of stale coffee and cheap cologne wafted from him. "You know," he said, his voice dropping to a tone he likely thought was intimidating. "You're a long way from anywhere, Mississippi. People out here don't usually take kindly to outsiders who don't respect the local customs." Angela's eyes flickered briefly to his name tag. Officer Bradley. She committed it to memory, along with the gleam of his polished badge and the faint stain on his shirt where grease from his breakfast had dripped. He was sloppy, arrogant, and overly confident in his authority. Men like him rarely noticed details, and she counted on that. "I respect laws," Angela replied evenly, her tone devoid of fear. "But I don't respect abuse of power." Jenkins, still leaning against the booth, let out a low whistle. "Feisty," he muttered, shaking his head. "Don't you know when to play nice, sweetheart?" Angela shifted her gaze to Jenkins, studying him for a moment. His cocky grin faltered ever so slightly under her steady stare. "If you think nice means tolerating harassment, you're mistaken," she said, her words precise, her voice a razor's edge. Around them, the diner patrons were watching with varying degrees of unease. The waitress who had served Angela earlier lingered behind the counter, wringing her hands as she exchanged worried glances with the cook. A young man sitting by the window had his phone out, recording the scene despite his trembling hands. Angela noticed it all without turning her head, every movement, every sound. She had been trained to read a room, to analyze threats, and to anticipate outcomes. Right now, the room was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Bradley's face darkened at her words, his arrogance giving way to irritation. "You're pretty mouthy for someone who's not from around here," he said, his voice laced with menace. "Maybe we should take this conversation somewhere more private." Angela's grip on the edge of the table tightened imperceptibly. "If you think that would intimidate me, you're welcome to try." Jenkins laughed, a short, harsh sound. "She's got a mouth on her, Brad. Maybe she needs a lesson in respect." Bradley nodded, his expression hardening. "That's exactly what I was thinking." He reached for her arm, his hand moving with deliberate slowness, as if he enjoyed the theatrics of asserting control. Angela didn't flinch, didn't move. She simply watched his hand approach, her calm demeanor never wavering. But before he could touch her, she spoke. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Bradley hesitated, his hand hovering in midair. "And why is that?" he asked, his tone mocking. Angela leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Because you're making a mistake you won't be able to walk away from." For a brief moment, uncertainty flickered across Bradley's face. He glanced at Jenkins, who shrugged as if to say, "She's bluffing." Emboldened, Bradley smirked and grabbed her wrist. It happened so fast that the bystanders didn't realize what was happening until it was over. 1 second, Bradley was gripping Angela's wrist, and the next, he was flat on his back, his breath knocked out of him. Angela had twisted his arm and swept his legs out from under him in one fluid motion, her movements precise and controlled. Jenkins stepped forward, reaching for his weapon, but Angela was faster. She stood and blocked his reach, her presence commanding the room. "That's enough," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Bradley groaned as he sat up, clutching his wrist. "What the hell was that?" he spat, glaring up at her. "That," Angela said, her voice steady and cold, "was a warning." Jenkins, still stunned, took a cautious step back. "Who the hell are you?" Angela pulled a small leather wallet from her purse, flipping it open to reveal her credentials. The shiny badge and the bold letters of the Central Intelligence Agency caught the light, drawing gasps from the bystanders. "I'm someone you should have thought twice about harassing," she said, her gaze piercing. "But now it's too late." Bradley's face turned ashen as he struggled to his feet. "You're lying," he stammered. "This has to be fake." Angela smiled, a small, knowing smile that sent chills down his spine. "Would you like to test that theory? Because I assure you, your careers are about to take a very public nosedive." The diner erupted into murmurs. The young man with the phone lowered it slightly, his mouth agape. The waitress behind the counter crossed her arms, her expression shifting from fear to satisfaction. Justice was finally being served, and the whole town was watching. Angela glanced around, noting the crowd. She didn't enjoy public confrontations, but this one served a purpose. It wasn't just about putting Bradley and Jenkins in their place. It was about sending a message to everyone watching. Before the officers could respond, the faint sound of sirens echoed in the distance. Angela's calm smile returned. "And that," she said, "will be the FBI." Bradley's eyes widened. "The FBI? What? You thought you could operate unchecked?" Angela said, cutting him off. "You thought your power made you untouchable? But your arrogance has blinded you to the truth. There's always someone watching." As the sirens grew louder, Angela stepped back, her posture relaxed but commanding. "Enjoy your last moments in uniform," she said. "You've earned what's coming." The sharp wail of sirens pierced the quiet of the small-town morning, growing louder with each passing second. Heads turned toward the diner's wide glass windows, where a line of unmarked black SUVs, their lights flashing ominously, rolled into the parking lot. The air inside the diner was thick with tension, a strange cocktail of dread, curiosity, and disbelief. Angela Hayes stood calmly near her booth, her expression serene yet unyielding. Bradley and Jenkins, however, were anything but composed. Bradley fumbled to adjust his belt and badge, as if those symbols of authority could shield him from what was coming. Jenkins, on the other hand, had gone pale, his cocky grin long gone. His hand hovered near his holstered weapon, but he didn't dare draw it. The SUVs came to a stop, their doors swinging open in unison. Men and women in crisp black suits stepped out, their movements deliberate, their faces unreadable. The insignia of the Federal Bureau of Investigation gleamed on their lapels, unmistakable even to those who had never encountered federal agents before. The first agent to step into the diner was a tall man with salt and pepper hair and a sharp gaze that swept the room in seconds. His name tag identified him as Special Agent Carter, a name that carried weight in law enforcement circles. Angela's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. She knew Carter well. His reputation for dismantling corruption preceded him. Carter's eyes landed on Angela. He gave her a small nod, his expression neutral but respectful. "Agent Hayes," he said in a voice that carried authority, "are you all right?" Angela inclined her head slightly. "I'm fine. But these officers," she gestured toward Bradley and Jenkins without looking at them, "are not." The room erupted in murmurs. Bystanders whispered in hushed tones, their shock evident. The young man who had been recording the confrontation earlier now held his phone higher, capturing every second of the unfolding drama. "Wait a minute," Bradley sputtered, his voice cracking under the weight of his panic. "What is this? We didn't do anything wrong. This is a setup." Carter turned his gaze on the officer, his eyes cold. "Officer Bradley, you're speaking to a CIA agent and interfering with an ongoing federal investigation. Do you really want to dig that hole any deeper?" Jenkins took a step back, bumping into a table. "We didn't know. She didn't say who she was." Angela's voice, calm and steady, cut through the chaos. "You didn't ask. Instead, you chose to harass me. You abused your power because you thought I was defenseless. You assumed that your badge made you untouchable. Bradley pointed a trembling finger at Angela. You don't understand. We were just doing our job. Touching my skirt. Angela interrupted, her tone icy. Making crude comments? Threatening to take me somewhere private? If that's your job, Officer Bradley, then you're not fit to wear that uniform. Carter raised a hand, silencing the room. Enough, he said firmly. He turned to one of the agents behind him, a younger man holding a tablet. Agent Daniels read them their rights. Daniels stepped forward, his expression blank as he began. Officers Bradley and Jenkins, you are under arrest for harassment, abuse of power, and interfering with a federal investigation. You have the right to remain silent. What? Bradley shouted, his face turning red. You can't do this. We're police officers. Angela crossed her arms, her eyes locked on Bradley. You think your position protects you? It doesn't. In fact, it makes your actions even more reprehensible. Jenkins raised his hands in a feeble attempt at defense. It was a misunderstanding. We didn't mean any harm. Angela stepped closer to him, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. When you touched me, you didn't see a person. You saw someone you thought you could intimidate, humiliate, and control. But here's the thing. You were wrong. Very wrong. The bystanders watched in stunned silence as the FBI agents moved to cuff Bradley and Jenkins. The young man with the phone muttered, "They're actually getting arrested. I can't believe this." The waitress, who had been nervously twisting her apron, suddenly stepped forward. "It's about time someone did something," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "Those two have been terrorizing this town for years." Angela turned her gaze to the waitress, her expression softening. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Your courage to speak up will make a difference." The waitress blinked rapidly, as if holding back tears. I'm glad someone finally stood up to them." As the agents led Bradley and Jenkins toward the door, Bradley turned his head, desperation etched across his face. "This isn't over," he shouted. "You'll regret this." Angela didn't flinch. She simply watched as they were escorted outside, their protests muffled by the sound of the SUV doors slamming shut. Carter approached Angela, his demeanor professional but warm. "You handled that well," he said. "You could have called us sooner." "I wanted them to show their true colors," Angela replied. "Now there's no room for excuses." Carter nodded, then gestured toward the door. "We'll take it from here, but I'll need your report." Angela gave a small smile. "It's already written in my head." Angela turned to the crowd, her voice calm but firm. "You've seen today what happens when people abuse their power, but you've also seen what happens when someone stands up to it. Don't let fear silence you. Hold your leaders accountable. This town deserves better." The room was silent for a moment. Then a smattering of applause broke out. The young man with the phone put it down and clapped, the sound growing louder as more people joined in. Angela gave them a final nod before following Carter out the door. As the last of the SUVs pulled away, the diner settled into an uneasy quiet, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. The quiet hum of the diner returned after the fleet of black SUVs disappeared down the street, but it was far from the same. Conversations that once buzzed with mundane topics now revolved around the spectacle they had just witnessed. Bystanders whispered in low tones, their faces marked with astonishment, unease, and for some, quiet satisfaction. Angela Hayes remained seated at her booth, sipping the last of her now lukewarm coffee. She hadn't moved since the agents had taken Bradley and Jenkins away, her gaze distant, her expression unreadable. To the casual observer, she appeared calm, but beneath her composed exterior, Angela's mind was busy calculating her next steps. The waitress who had warned Angela earlier approached her table cautiously, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her apron. "Miss Hayes?" she ventured hesitantly. Angela looked up, offering a small, reassuring smile. "Yes, I just wanted to say thank you," the waitress said, her voice trembling slightly. "What you did, standing up to them, that took courage. Not many people would have done that, especially not around here." Angela set her coffee mug down gently. "It wasn't just about standing up to them," she said. "It was about making sure they couldn't hurt anyone else." The waitress nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "You don't know how long we've been dealing with men like them. The whole department, they're all the same. They think they own this town." Angela tilted her head, studying the woman. "What's your name?" she asked softly. "Linda," the waitress replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Well, Linda," Angela said, leaning forward slightly, "what you did today took courage too. Speaking up, even in small ways, can make a difference." Linda wiped at her eyes with the corner of her apron. "I just hope it's enough." Angela's gaze hardened slightly, the fire in her eyes returning. It will be. People like Bradley and Jenkins thrive on fear and silence. The moment you take that away from them, they crumble. Angela glanced around the diner, noticing the wary glances from the remaining patrons. Some looked away when their eyes met hers, while others offered small, encouraging nods. It was clear that the town was grappling with the weight of what had just unfolded. A man in his late 40s, wearing a weathered denim jacket, approached her table next. His hands were rough, the kind that spoke of years of manual labor. "Ma'am," he began, his voice low but steady. "I just wanted to say we've needed someone like you around here for a long time." Angela gestured for him to sit, and he hesitated before lowering himself into the seat across from her. "What's your name?" she asked. "Tom Harris," he replied, his hands clasped tightly together on the table. "I run the hardware store down the street." "Nice to meet you, Tom," Angela said. "What's on your mind?" He shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to walk in. "Those two officers," he said, nodding toward where Bradley and Jenkins had been. "They're just the tip of the iceberg. The whole department's rotten, and they've got people scared stiff." Angela leaned back, crossing her arms. "What do you mean?" Tom lowered his voice. "They've been taking bribes, harassing small businesses, even framing folks who stand up to them. People here know it, but no one talks. They're afraid of what'll happen if they do." Angela studied him, her sharp mind piecing together the puzzle. "And you? Why are you telling me this now?" Tom met her gaze, his jaw tightening. "Because I'm tired of being afraid. And because I think you might actually be able to do something about it." Angela tapped her fingers lightly on the table, her thoughts churning. The FBI would conduct their investigation, but federal agencies often worked slowly, their reach limited by bureaucracy and red tape. Angela knew that if real change was going to happen in this town, it would require the people themselves to stand up and demand it. "Tom," she said finally, "if I'm going to help this town, I'll need more than stories. I'll need evidence, documents, recordings, anything that proves what's been going on." Tom hesitated, his brow furrowing. "I don't know if I can get my hands on that kind of stuff." "You don't have to do it alone," Angela said. "There are others in this town who want change, just like you. If you work together, you can gather what's needed." Linda, who had been standing nearby, stepped forward. "I'll help," she said firmly. "I've seen plenty over the years, things I wish I hadn't. If it means making this place better, I'll do whatever I can." Tom nodded slowly, a flicker of hope crossing his face. "All right," he said. "I'll see what I can do." Angela offered them both a reassuring smile. "Change takes time," she said, "but it starts with people like you." As the diner slowly emptied and the sun dipped lower in the sky, Angela remained seated, her mind still working through the details of her plan. She would stay in the town a little longer, long enough to ensure that the seeds of change she had planted would take root. Before leaving, she paid her bill and handed Linda an envelope. "In case you need a little extra support," she said. Linda opened the envelope, her eyes widening at the cash inside. I can't accept this," she stammered. "You can," Angela said firmly, "and you will. Consider it a small investment in this town's future." Linda nodded, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Thank you." Angela stepped outside, the cool evening air brushing against her skin. She glanced down the quiet street, her heart heavy with the weight of the work still to be done. But she was used to that weight. It was the burden she carried, the price of ensuring justice in places that had long forgotten its meaning. As she walked toward her car, the distant sound of church bells rang out, their echoes filling the air with a sense of quiet resolve. Angela paused for a moment, letting the sound wash over her. Then, with a steadying breath, she continued on her way, her mission far from over. Angela Hayes stood at the edge of the town's small park, the golden hues of the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the cracked concrete paths. A soft breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass mingled with the faint aroma of frying oil from a nearby food truck. The park was quiet, but not empty. A few children played on the rusting swings, their laughter ringing out sporadically. Their parents sat nearby, exchanging muted conversations, their voices tinged with an undercurrent of weariness. Angela was used to this feeling. A town weighed down by unseen chains, fear, apathy, and hopelessness often hung in the air in places like this. But she had seen it before, and she knew how to dismantle it. Change never came easily, but always started small. Seeds planted in unlikely soil could still grow strong. Angela walked slowly, her low heels clicking softly against the pavement, observing the small groups of people scattered across the park. Her presence turned a few heads, but most quickly looked away, unwilling to engage with a stranger. She understood their hesitance. It wasn't personal. It was the reflex of a community that had been taught to keep its head down and avoid trouble. Near a wooden bench that overlooked a patchy flower bed, Angela spotted Tom Harris sitting with an older man. The man's face was lined with deep wrinkles, his hands gnarled from years of labor. He looked up as Angela approached, his eyes narrowing slightly, but Tom quickly stood and waved her over. "Miss Hayes," Tom said, gesturing to the older man. "This is Henry. He's someone who knows a lot about this town." Angela extended her hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Henry." Henry hesitated for a moment before taking her hand, his grip surprisingly firm. "Can't say I've met anyone like you before," he said, his voice gravelly. "You got folks talking, you know." Angela smiled faintly. "I hope they're saying good things." Henry let out a dry chuckle. "Depends on who you ask. Some think you're trouble. Others think you're exactly what we've been needing." "And you?" Angela asked, meeting his gaze. Henry leaned back on the bench, studying her. "I've lived here long enough to know this place doesn't change. People like Bradley and Jenkins. They've always run things. Different faces, same corruption. But what you did at the diner, that shook things up." Angela took a seat on the bench beside him, her movements deliberate, her tone calm. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she said. "It starts with people willing to take a stand. People like Tom. People like you." Henry's eyes narrowed again. "I'm an old man. I don't have much left to stand for." "You'd be surprised," Angela replied gently. "Sometimes the smallest actions have the biggest impact." Over the next hour, Angela listened as Henry and Tom shared stories of the town's struggles. Henry spoke of how the police department had grown more corrupt over the years, abusing its power to extort money from local businesses and intimidate anyone who dared speak out. Tom added details about how officers like Bradley and Jenkins often targeted minorities and newcomers, ensuring they always felt unwelcome. Angela took it all in, asking questions only when necessary. She was careful not to push too hard, knowing that trust was fragile in places like this. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the horizon in shades of orange and pink, Henry finally leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "There's a storage unit," he said, "out near the edge of town. Bradley and Jenkins have been using it for years to stash whatever it is they don't want people finding. I've seen them there late at night, loading and unloading boxes." Angela's interest sharpened. "Do you know what's in the boxes?" Henry shook his head. "No, but if you're looking for proof, that's where you'll find it." By the time Angela left the park, the air had grown cooler, and the faint glow of street lights cast long shadows on the cracked sidewalks. Her steps were measured, her mind working through the details of what Henry had shared. The storage unit could be the key to exposing the full extent of the department's corruption, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. People like Bradley and Jenkins didn't operate without covering their tracks. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from Special Agent Carter. "Any leads?" Angela paused under a street light, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. After a moment, she typed a reply. "Yes. Potential evidence location identified. We'll investigate and report back." She slipped the phone back into her pocket and continued walking, her resolve hardening with each step. This wasn't just about exposing Bradley and Jenkins anymore. It was about dismantling the entire system that had allowed them to thrive. And for that, she would need to tread carefully, ensuring that every piece of evidence she uncovered was airtight. The next morning, Angela returned to the diner for breakfast. The atmosphere inside was noticeably different. Conversations were livelier, the air less tense. Linda greeted her with a genuine smile, placing a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of her without needing to ask. "You've got people talking," Linda said as she refilled Angela's coffee. "For the first time in years, it feels like something might actually change." Angela sipped her coffee, her gaze sweeping the room. She noticed Tom sitting with a few other townsfolk, gesturing animatedly as he spoke. Henry was seated by the window, nodding slowly as he listened. It was subtle, but the shift in the town's energy was undeniable. Angela allowed herself a small smile. It was only the beginning, but it was enough to remind her why she did this work. Change might be slow, but it was happening, and she wouldn't stop until the scales of justice tipped firmly in the right direction. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the small town bathed in the dim light of street lamps and the faint glow of shop windows. Angela Hayes parked her car on a gravel road just outside the town's limits, the engine cutting off with a soft rumble. Ahead, a cluster of storage units sat in silence, their corrugated metal walls reflecting the faint moonlight. The lot was bordered by tall chain-link fences topped with rusty barbed wire, giving the place an air of abandonment. Angela stepped out of the car, her movements slow and deliberate. She adjusted the small black bag slung over her shoulder, ensuring that its contents, her notebook, camera, and a compact flashlight, were easily accessible. This was a routine she had practiced countless times before, yet the weight of each mission never left her. She scanned the area, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. The subtle hum of a nearby transformer, the flicker of a faulty security light, the muffled bark of a dog in the distance. She was alone, as planned. This wasn't a task she could delegate, not yet. The information Henry had given her about the storage unit was too delicate to involve anyone else. If the unit contained what she suspected evidence of corruption, extortion, and worse, it would be a turning point in her mission. Angela crouched near the edge of the fence, pulling out a pair of small binoculars from her bag. Through the lenses, she surveyed the lot. The storage units were arranged in neat rows, their faded numbers barely visible under the dim lights. A single security camera hung from a pole near the entrance, its lens panning slowly. She noted its rhythm, a 2-second pause at each end of its sweep. It wasn't the first time she had seen a setup like this, low budget and predictable. Her gaze shifted to a unit near the back of the lot, its door slightly dented, the paint around its edges scuffed. This matched Henry's description, Unit 47. She focused on the small details, the lack of a padlock, the faint marks on the gravel in front of the unit where a vehicle had been parked recently. Someone had been here, but they weren't here now. Angela exhaled slowly. She had the advantage. Pulling on a pair of thin gloves, Angela approached the fence, her movements soundless on the gravel. She reached into her bag, retrieving a compact set of tools. In less than a minute, the fence's old padlock clicked open, and she slipped through the gap, pulling the chain link back into place behind her. She kept to the shadows, her footsteps carefully measured as she made her way toward Unit 47. The silence of the lot was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the transformer. Her pulse quickened, though her breathing remained steady. Every nerve in her body was attuned to her surroundings, trained to detect the slightest sign of movement. Reaching the unit, she crouched beside the door, running her gloved fingers along its edges. The latch mechanism was simple, a standard sliding lock that required little effort to disengage. She hesitated, listening. The stillness was deafening. Satisfied, she pulled the latch free and lifted the door just enough to slip inside. The interior of the unit smelled of dust and damp metal. Angela clicked on her flashlight, its narrow beam cutting through the darkness. Stacks of cardboard boxes lined the walls, some sealed with fresh tape, others partially open. She moved carefully, her light skimming over the labels. Invoices, receipts, confiscated items. One box in particular caught her attention. Its label read, "Evidence, pending disposal." Angela knelt beside it, her hands steady as she opened the flaps. Inside, she found plastic bags containing various items, a bundle of cash, a handgun, and a stack of documents. Each bag was marked with case numbers, but the accompanying paperwork was incomplete, as if someone had deliberately erased key details. Her stomach tightened. This wasn't just a stash of confiscated goods. It was evidence of a system designed to exploit and silence. She took out her camera, photographing each item meticulously. The images would be enough to secure an investigation, but she knew the documents were the real prize. As Angela worked, a faint noise reached her ears, the crunch of gravel underfoot. Her entire body tensed, her hand instinctively moving to the compact firearm holstered beneath her jacket. She turned off the flashlight, plunging the unit into darkness, and crouched low behind a stack of boxes. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the faint jingle of keys. Through the narrow opening of the unit's door, Angela saw a figure approaching. The glow of a cigarette illuminated the man's face for a brief moment. Officer Bradley. Her breath caught. Of all the people she had expected, Bradley was the last. He had been taken into custody hours earlier. Was he out on bail already? Or had someone within the department pulled strings to secure his release? Either way, His presence here confirmed her suspicions. This wasn't just about rogue officers. The corruption ran deeper than she had imagined. Bradley reached the door of Unit 47, his boots scuffing against the gravel as he muttered under his breath. Angela's pulse quickened as she calculated her options. She couldn't risk confrontation, not here. Her mission was to gather evidence, not escalate the situation. As Bradley reached for the door handle, Angela slid further into the shadows, her movements slow and deliberate. She clutched the small camera in her hand, ready to capture whatever happened next. To her relief, Bradley didn't open the door. Instead, he stood outside, pulling out his phone. "Yeah," he said, his voice low but angry. "I'm at the unit now. Everything's still here." "No, I haven't seen anyone, but we need to move this stuff tonight." Angela strained to hear the other side of the conversation, but the voice was too faint to make out. Bradley's agitation, however, was clear. "I don't care who's watching. If this stuff gets out, we're all screwed." Angela waited until Bradley walked away, his cigarette glowing faintly in the darkness as he disappeared into the distance. She remained motionless for several minutes, ensuring the coast was clear before making her move. Carefully, she secured the box she had been examining and slipped out of the unit. Her heart pounded as she retraced her steps, slipping through the fence and back to her car. Once inside, she allowed herself a moment to breathe, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The stakes had just risen dramatically. Bradley's presence and his phone call confirmed what she already suspected. This wasn't just a small-town problem. It was a network of corruption with deep roots. Angela started the car and drove away, her mind already formulating the next steps. She had the evidence she needed to bring this to light, but she also had a new challenge, staying ahead of those who would do anything to keep it buried. The drive back to town felt longer than usual. Angela's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty road ahead, but her thoughts were miles away. The encounter with Bradley replayed in her mind, every detail etched into her memory, his hurried tone, the unmistakable panic in his voice, and the cryptic words about moving the stuff that night. The box of evidence she had photographed sat in the back seat, secured and covered with an old blanket. She had enough to spark an investigation, but she also knew this was just the tip of the iceberg. Whatever Bradley and his accomplices were planning, it wasn't just about covering their tracks. It was about erasing them completely. As Angela approached the outskirts of town, she pulled into the quiet parking lot of a small motel. Its neon vacancy sign buzzed faintly, casting an eerie red glow over the gravel lot. She had checked into this place when she first arrived, choosing it for its anonymity. Now, it felt like a safe haven, a temporary fortress where she could regroup and plan her next move. Inside her room, Angela locked the door and secured the deadbolt. She placed the evidence bag on the small wooden table by the window, pulling out her laptop and camera. The motel room was sparse, faded wallpaper, a worn-out armchair, and a faint smell of mildew. But Angela barely noticed. Her focus was on the photos she had taken. She uploaded the images, studying each one carefully. The bags of cash were unmarked, their origin unclear, but their presence in a police-controlled storage unit raised more questions than answers. The handgun was another red flag. Its serial number had been partially filed off, suggesting it had been used in illicit activities. But it was the stack of documents that held Angela's attention the longest. The paperwork was incomplete, deliberately vague, but certain details stood out. Case numbers linked to closed investigations, property seizure forms without signatures, and names of individuals who had allegedly been processed by the department. Angela's stomach tightened as she recognized a pattern. This wasn't random corruption, it was systemic. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she began typing a report, her words precise and factual. Every piece of evidence needed to be cataloged, every irregularity noted. If this was going to bring down the corrupt network, it had to be airtight. Angela's phone vibrated on the table, breaking the silence. She glanced at the screen. Special Agent Carter. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Agent Hayes." Carter's voice came through, steady but curious. "You've been quiet. Any updates?" "I have evidence," Angela said, keeping her voice low. "Photographs, documents, and confirmation of a storage unit being used to hide assets. But there's more. Bradley's involved, and he's not acting alone. He was at the unit tonight, making plans to move everything." There was a pause on the other end, and Angela could almost hear Carter processing the information. "Are you certain?" Certain enough to know they'll destroy the evidence if we don't act quickly, she replied. I need a team, Carter. Discreet, but effective. Carter exhaled audibly. I'll see what I can do, but this kind of operation takes time, and we need jurisdictional clearance. We don't have time, Angela said firmly. They're planning to move everything tonight. If we wait, we lose our chance. There was another pause, followed by Carter's reluctant agreement. I'll send backup. You'll have a small team within the hour. Don't engage until they arrive. Angela ended the call, her heart pounding. She trusted Carter, but she also knew how quickly plans could fall apart. She had to be ready for anything. The waiting was the hardest part. Angela sat in the armchair by the window, her laptop balanced on her knees. She had drafted her report, reviewed the photos, and planned contingencies for every scenario she could imagine. Still, the minutes dragged by, each one heavier than the last. Her thoughts wandered to the townspeople she had spoken with earlier, Linda, Tom, and even Henry. They had placed their trust in her, hoping she could bring about the change they desperately needed. Failure wasn't an option, not for them and not for herself. She checked her watch. 45 minutes had passed. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Carter, team en route. ETA 15 minutes. Stand by. Angela set the phone down and rose to her feet, stretching out the tension that had built in her shoulders. She double-checked the contents of her bag, flashlight, gloves, tools, and a small recorder. Everything was ready. Now, all she needed was the team. Exactly 15 minutes later, a soft knock echoed through the room. Angela approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. A man and a woman stood outside, dressed in plain clothes but carrying themselves with the unmistakable demeanor of federal agents. Angela opened the door just enough to confirm their identities. Agent Hayes? The man asked. His voice was low, his eyes sharp. That's me, she replied, stepping aside to let them in. The man introduced himself as Agent Miller, while the woman, younger but equally serious, was Agent Torres. They carried a small duffel bag between them, which they set on the table. Carter briefed us, Miller said, his tone clipped. We're here to assist, but you're leading the operation. What's the plan? Angela outlined the situation, her voice steady and confident. She described the storage unit, the evidence inside, and Bradley's likely involvement. Miller and Torres listened intently, nodding at key points. We need to move fast, Angela concluded. They could arrive at any moment, and we can't afford to let this slip through our fingers. The team spent the next few minutes reviewing their equipment and syncing their plans. Angela felt a flicker of reassurance as she watched Miller and Torres work. Their efficiency and focus were reminders that she wasn't alone in this fight. As they prepared to leave, Torres glanced at Angela. If this goes south, we'll cover you, she said quietly. You've got guts, coming here alone. Angela gave a faint smile. It's not about guts. It's about doing what's right. Torres nodded, her respect evident. Let's make sure this counts. The three agents exited the motel, their movements swift and deliberate. The air was cool, the night sky dotted with stars that offered little comfort. As they approached their vehicles, Angela's mind raced through the plan one final time. This was it, the moment where everything could either come together or fall apart. The evidence, the operation, the trust of the people she had met of it hinged on what would happen in the next few hours. Angela slid into the driver's seat, her fingers gripping the wheel tightly. She glanced at the rearview mirror, meeting her own steady gaze. Let's finish this, she murmured. And with that, she started the car and drove into the darkness, the headlights cutting through the void ahead. The storage unit lot was eerily silent, bathed in the pale glow of the moon and the weak, flickering light of the single security lamp. Angela Hayes crouched behind a stack of rusted barrels near the fence, her team, Agents Miller and Torres, flanking her in the shadows. The gravel crunched faintly under their feet as they adjusted their positions, all eyes trained on Unit 47. The plan was clear: intercept and secure the evidence before Bradley and his accomplices could destroy it. They couldn't afford to make mistakes. This was the moment everything hinged on. The faint roar of an engine broke the stillness. Angela's hand instinctively tightened around her flashlight as she watched the beam of headlights crest the hill. A black pickup truck rolled into the lot, its tires kicking up small clouds of dust. The truck came to a halt just a few feet from Unit 47, and three men climbed out. Angela recognized Bradley immediately. His gait was heavy, his face a mask of irritation as he barked orders to the others. One of the men, a wiry figure with a nervous energy, fumbled with a set of keys, clearly uncomfortable. The third man was stockier, his movements deliberate as he glanced around the lot. "They're jumpy," Torres murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "They know they're being watched." "They don't know it's us," Angela replied, her eyes fixed on Bradley. "Not yet." Bradley unlocked the storage unit, sliding the door up with a loud, metallic groan. The dim interior light flickered on, casting shadows over the stacks of boxes inside. The wiry man stepped in first, pulling out a dolly as the others began loading boxes onto it. Angela signaled to Miller and Torres, her hand movements precise and silent. The three agents began to move, their steps slow and measured as they closed the distance to the unit. Every muscle in Angela's body was coiled with tension, her breathing steady as she approached the moment of confrontation. They were just a few feet away when Bradley turned abruptly, his eyes narrowing as he caught sight of movement in the shadows. "Hey," he barked, reaching for his weapon. "Who's there?" "Federal agents." Angela's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. She stepped into the light, her badge held high. "Put your hands where I can see them." Chaos erupted. Bradley froze for a split second before drawing his weapon, but Miller was faster, his own gun trained on Bradley in an instant. "Drop it," Miller shouted, his tone leaving no room for argument. The wiry man panicked, dropping the box he was holding as he stumbled backward, his hands flying up in surrender. The stockier man hesitated, his eyes darting between Angela and Bradley before raising his hands slowly. Bradley, however, wasn't ready to give up. "You've got no idea what you're messing with," he growled, his gun trembling in his hand. "You think you can come into my town and—" "Drop the weapon, Bradley," Angela said, her voice calm but firm. She took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. "This isn't your town anymore." For a moment, it seemed like Bradley might resist. His grip on the gun tightened, his jaw clenched. But then his gaze flicked to the agents behind Angela, to the badges gleaming under the harsh light, and the reality of the situation sank in. With a frustrated snarl, he let the gun fall to the ground. Miller and Torres moved quickly, securing the men in handcuffs as Angela stepped into the storage unit. Her flashlight swept over the boxes, confirming what she had seen earlier. The evidence was all there, undeniable proof of corruption, extortion, and abuse of power. She took a moment to let the gravity of it sink in. This was what justice looked like, raw and unfiltered. Outside, Bradley was still seething, his words venomous. "You think this is over?" he spat as Torres secured his cuffs. "You think taking me down will change anything? You're wasting your time." Angela stepped out of the unit, her expression calm but steely. She stopped in front of Bradley, her gaze locking onto his. "Change takes time," she said evenly, "but it starts with taking out people like you." Bradley sneered but said nothing, his confidence visibly cracking. By dawn, the storage unit lot was swarming with agents. Evidence was being cataloged, vehicles loaded with boxes, and every detail meticulously documented. Bradley and his accomplices sat in the back of separate SUVs, their faces grim as they awaited transport. Angela stood near the edge of the lot, her arms crossed as she watched the operation unfold. She felt the weight of exhaustion settle over her, but it was tempered by the quiet satisfaction of a mission accomplished. This wasn't the end, far from it, but it was a critical victory. Miller approached, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You did good, Hayes," he said. "This is going to make waves." "It's a start," Angela replied, her tone thoughtful. "But there's more to uncover. This network didn't start and end with Bradley. We'll take it from here," Miller assured her. "You've done enough." Angela nodded, though she knew she wouldn't be stepping away entirely. This was her mission, and she would see it through to the end. Later that morning, Angela returned to the diner, the weight of the night still heavy on her shoulders. Inside, the atmosphere was different, livelier, more hopeful. Linda greeted her with a wide smile, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Word's already spreading," Linda said as she poured Angela a fresh cup of coffee. "People are talking about what happened last night. About you." Angela sipped her coffee, her gaze drifting to the window. Outside, she could see Tom and Henry speaking with a small group of townsfolk. Their gestures were animated, their faces determined. "It's not about me," Angela said quietly. "It's about this town. They're the ones who will make the change." Linda nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe, but someone had to show them how." Angela smiled faintly, her resolve solidifying. This wasn't the end of her story, it was just the beginning of theirs. As Angela drove out of town later that day, the morning sun casting a golden glow over the fields, she felt a rare sense of peace. The road ahead was long, and the fight for justice never truly ended. But for now, she had done her part. Seeds of change had been planted, and she had no doubt they would grow. The faint sound of church bells rang out in the distance as Angela disappeared into the horizon, ready to take on whatever came next.